Let me begin with something uncomfortable, because uncomfortable truths are usually where serious analysis has to start. For years, American foreign policy debates have developed a strange habit of describing military failures with language designed to make them sound temporary, manageable, and far less serious than they actually are. A failed operation becomes a strategic adjustment. A stalled campaign becomes a new phase. A negotiated settlement after months of pressure is presented not as a retreat, but as evidence that pressure was working all along. In Washington, words often become a tool for protecting assumptions. They soften defeats, hide contradictions, and create the impression that a strategy remains successful even when the reality on the ground tells a very different story. And that is exactly why what has happened in the Persian Gulf deserves a much more honest examination. Because this is not simply another diplomatic disagreement or another temporary crisis between rival governments. What we are witnessing is a deeper moment in international politics, a moment that reveals the limits of military power when it is used to solve problems that are fundamentally political. The United States remains the most powerful military force on Earth, but the events of recent months raise a difficult question that many policymakers have avoided asking. What happens when the world's strongest military discovers that even overwhelming force cannot always produce the political outcome it wants? The conflict that unfolded in the Persian Gulf was not a minor exchange of threats or a brief confrontation. It developed into a sustained military campaign. For weeks, American forces carried out extensive air operations against Iranian military infrastructure, targeting facilities and systems that Washington believed were central to Iran's regional capabilities. This was not symbolic action. It was not a limited message. It was a serious attempt to use military pressure to force a major political change. But after the campaign ended, the most important question remained unanswered. What was actually achieved? Did Iran abandon its strategic objectives? Did its leadership collapse under pressure? Did the balance of power in the region fundamentally shift? Did the military campaign create the kind of surrender or transformation that its supporters predicted? The answer appears to be no. And the reason that matters is because military strategies are ultimately judged by outcomes, not by the intensity of the force used. A campaign can be powerful, expensive, and technically impressive, yet still fail if it does not accomplish the political goals that justified it. After the air campaign, the conflict entered another stage. The United States turned toward naval pressure and economic leverage, attempting to use control of maritime access and broader restrictions to force Iran into accepting Washington's demands. This represented a significant escalation because blockades and maritime pressure are among the strongest tools available short of a full invasion. They are designed to isolate an opponent, restrict resources, and create unbearable pressure over time. But once again, the central question remained the same. Did it work? If the goal was to force Iran into complete capitulation, the answer was again unclear. Instead of producing a decisive victory, the confrontation moved toward negotiation. Eventually, both sides entered discussions that resulted in an agreement that many critics described as far closer to Tehran's position than Washington's original demands. This sequence reveals something important. First came military force, then came economic pressure, then came diplomacy. And after each stage failed to produce the outcome that many expected, the strategy shifted. That does not necessarily mean every decision was irrational or every objective was impossible. International conflicts are complicated, and governments rarely have perfect information. But it does suggest that the original assumptions behind the strategy deserve serious examination. Because if military pressure was supposed to force Iran into submission, and it did not, then the problem may not simply have been execution. The deeper question is whether the strategy itself was built on unrealistic expectations. This is where the debate becomes much more interesting, because the people who continue to argue that maximum pressure will eventually succeed are not necessarily uninformed. Many are experienced analysts, military officials, and policymakers who have spent decades studying the region. They understand the history, the weapon systems, and the geopolitical stakes. So why do they continue defending a strategy that appears to have produced limited results? Part of the answer is ideology. There is a powerful tradition within American foreign policy thinking that assumes American military superiority can eventually overcome almost any obstacle if enough pressure is applied. This worldview is not based on the belief that wars are easy. Rather, it is based on the belief that America's technological advantage, military reach, and economic power give it the ability to shape outcomes almost anywhere in the world. But conflicts like Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq challenge that assumption. They raise a difficult possibility that military dominance does not automatically translate into political control. A country can destroy infrastructure. It can weaken an opponent's capabilities. It can create enormous damage. But changing the political behavior of another society is far more complicated. History repeatedly shows that people and governments will often endure extraordinary hardship when they believe they are defending sovereignty, identity, or survival. That is the reality Iran has operated under for decades. The Iranian leadership has built its strategy around the belief that it does not need to defeat the United States in a traditional military sense. It simply needs to make the cost of continued confrontation high enough that Washington eventually questions whether the fight is worth continuing. And that approach has shaped everything from Iran's missile development to its regional partnerships and military doctrine. The goal was never necessarily to match American power directly. The goal was to create enough uncertainty, enough cost, and enough risk that American leaders would eventually choose negotiation over endless escalation. And that is exactly the kind of strategic calculation that many governments outside Washington have learned to make in the modern era. This is where the situation becomes even more significant, because the confrontation with Iran is not only about one country or one military campaign. It is part of a much larger transformation happening in global power politics. For decades, the United States operated in an international environment where its influence was unmatched. After the end of the Cold War, Washington entered what many described as a unipolar moment, a period where American economic, military, and political power gave it an ability to shape events across the world that no other country could seriously challenge. During that era, American leaders became accustomed to the idea that if a problem threatened U.S. interests, there was usually a military option available. The United States had unmatched aircraft carriers, advanced weapons systems, global bases, and alliances stretching across continents. This created a belief that American power could be projected almost anywhere, and that opponents would eventually be forced to accept Washington's terms. But the world that existed in the 1990s and early 2000s is no longer the world of today. The global system has changed dramatically. New powers have risen, regional actors have become more capable, and countries that once had little ability to resist American pressure now have sophisticated strategies for doing exactly that. China has developed into a major global competitor. Russia continues to possess enormous influence because of its nuclear arsenal and strategic position. Countries like Iran, Turkey, India, and Saudi Arabia have expanded their ability to operate independently and resist outside pressure. The result is a world that is far more complicated than the one Washington dominated after the Cold War. In this new environment, military strength still matters, but it no longer guarantees political success. That is the lesson many analysts believe the Persian Gulf crisis demonstrates. Iran understood something important about modern warfare. Direct competition with the United States would be almost impossible. A traditional battlefield confrontation would heavily favor American forces. So instead, Iran focused on the areas where American power is less effective. This is the foundation of asymmetric strategy. Rather than trying to build an equal military force, Iran invested in tools that could create uncertainty and raise the cost of intervention. Missile systems, drones, naval capabilities, and regional partnerships became ways to challenge a stronger opponent without fighting a conventional war. The Strait of Hormuz became one of the most important examples of this strategy. The strait is one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. A huge portion of global energy supplies passes through this narrow passage, making it essential not only for Gulf countries, but also for major economies around the world. Any serious disruption would immediately affect energy markets, trade, and global stability. Iran's geographic position gives it influence over this area. And over decades, it has developed the ability to threaten shipping and create serious complications for any force attempting to operate there. The weapons involved are not necessarily the most advanced or expensive systems in the world. They do not represent the kind of technology that dominates military exhibitions or defense industry marketing. But they are effective because they are designed for a specific purpose: creating risk. A low-cost weapon that forces an opponent to spend billions defending against it can become strategically powerful. This is one of the major changes in modern warfare. The side with the most expensive equipment does not always have the advantage. Sometimes the side that can create the most uncertainty holds the leverage. And that is what makes the current situation so difficult. The United States entered the confrontation believing its military superiority could create a decisive outcome. Iran approached it differently. Iran's objective was not necessarily victory through destruction. Its objective was survival, deterrence, and forcing the United States to recognize the limits of escalation. In that sense, Iran's strategy was built around patience. It understood that American military power is enormous, but it also understood that American political patience is not unlimited. Every military operation requires public support. Every deployment creates financial costs. Every prolonged conflict creates pressure from voters, businesses, allies, and political opponents. A country can have the strongest military in the world and still face limits on how long it can sustain a conflict. That is the reality many weaker states have recognized throughout history. They do not need to defeat a superpower completely. They need to survive long enough for the superpower to question whether continuing is worth the price. This pattern has appeared repeatedly in modern conflicts. Vietnam demonstrated that military superiority does not guarantee political victory. Afghanistan showed that even overwhelming force can struggle against determined resistance and difficult geography. Iraq revealed the enormous challenge of transforming a society through military intervention. Each conflict contained unique circumstances, but they all raised the same fundamental question: how much can military power actually achieve? The answer appears to be much less than many strategists once believed. And this brings us to one of the most important issues surrounding the Iran confrontation: the nuclear question. The nuclear program was one of the central reasons many officials argued that pressure against Iran was necessary. Their argument was that allowing Iran to approach nuclear capability would fundamentally change the balance of power in the Middle East. A nuclear-capable Iran could alter regional calculations. Other countries might seek their own nuclear options. Existing security agreements could be weakened. The entire structure of non-proliferation could face new pressure. From this perspective, preventing Iran from reaching that point seemed like a strategic priority. But the challenge is that military action does not always eliminate the problem it is designed to solve. In some cases, it can make the problem more intense. The attacks against Iranian facilities may have slowed parts of the program, but they did not necessarily eliminate the knowledge, infrastructure, or motivation behind it. And this creates a paradox. The effort to prevent Iran from becoming more determined to pursue nuclear capability may have increased the belief inside Iran that such capability is necessary for survival. From Tehran's perspective, the lesson may be simple. Countries without nuclear deterrence are vulnerable to outside pressure, while countries with nuclear weapons receive far more caution from their opponents. Whether that conclusion is correct or not, it is a powerful perception. And perceptions often shape international decisions as much as reality itself. This is why future negotiations will be extremely difficult. The United States wants guarantees that Iran will limit its nuclear ambitions and reduce regional threats. Iran wants recognition of its sovereignty, security concerns, and regional influence. Both sides are negotiating from completely different assumptions about what creates stability. Washington traditionally sees stability as requiring limits on Iranian power. Tehran sees stability as requiring protection from external pressure. Those two visions are fundamentally opposed, and that is why the next phase may prove even harder than the conflict itself. The larger lesson from this confrontation goes far beyond the Persian Gulf, because what happened here reveals a much bigger change in the balance of international power. For decades, the United States was able to operate with a level of freedom that no other country in modern history had experienced. It maintained military bases across the world, protected major trade routes, supported allies on multiple continents, and often had the ability to influence the decisions of smaller states through a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and military force. But the foundation that made that system possible has started to weaken. This does not mean the United States has suddenly become powerless. It remains one of the most influential countries on Earth. Its economy, military technology, alliances, and global reach are still enormous. But influence is not the same as control, and the difference between those two things has become increasingly clear. A country can have the ability to destroy an opponent's military assets and still fail to achieve its political goals. It can dominate the battlefield and still lose the larger strategic competition. Because in international politics, the final outcome is not determined only by weapons. It is determined by what happens after the weapons are used. That is where many military strategies face their greatest challenge. A bombing campaign can damage facilities, but it cannot automatically create a new political reality. A blockade can create pressure, but it cannot guarantee surrender. Sanctions can weaken an economy, but they do not always force a government to change its priorities. Sometimes pressure creates the opposite reaction. Sometimes it convinces a rival that compromise is too dangerous, and that survival requires becoming even more independent and resistant. That is one of the central dynamics behind Iran's strategy. For years, Iranian leaders have watched countries around the world experience foreign intervention, regime change attempts, and military pressure. Their conclusion has been that dependence on outside powers creates vulnerability. Therefore, their goal has been to develop enough independent capability that no outside actor can easily force them into submission. This strategy has not made Iran immune to pressure. The country has faced enormous economic challenges, internal debates, and international isolation. But it has created something extremely important in geopolitics: deterrence. Deterrence is not always about having the strongest force. It is about convincing an opponent that the cost of attacking you will be too high. And Iran's ability to create costs has been one of the biggest reasons Washington has repeatedly returned to negotiations. This brings up another uncomfortable reality about modern warfare. The strongest country does not always decide when a conflict ends. Sometimes the weaker side determines the timeline simply by refusing to collapse. That is what happened in many conflicts throughout history. Great powers often enter wars expecting quick results because their military advantage appears overwhelming. But wars are not just contests between weapons. They are contests between societies, political systems, economies, and levels of endurance. And endurance is something that cannot be measured only through military statistics. This is also why the consequences of the Iran conflict extend into Asia, especially the relationship between the United States and China. For American strategists, the most important long-term challenge is no longer the Middle East. It is the Pacific. The future balance of power will likely be shaped by competition between Washington and Beijing, especially around issues involving Taiwan, maritime security, technology, and regional influence. And China has been watching every major American military operation very carefully. Every conflict provides information. Every deployment reveals capabilities. Every crisis shows both strengths and weaknesses. From Beijing's perspective, the events in the Gulf may raise important questions about American power projection. If the United States struggled to achieve its objectives against a regional opponent like Iran, what does that reveal about a future confrontation with a much larger competitor? If American forces become heavily committed in one region, how much flexibility remains elsewhere? If military resources are stretched, how quickly can they be redirected? These are the kinds of calculations that major powers make. They do not only watch what countries say, they watch what countries actually do. And this creates a difficult situation for American foreign policy. On one hand, the United States increasingly needs to focus resources toward Asia and the growing competition with China. On the other hand, repeated crises in other regions continue consuming military attention, political energy, and financial resources. This is the challenge of being a global power. Every commitment creates another responsibility. Every alliance creates expectations. Every intervention creates consequences. And eventually, a country has to decide whether it can continue trying to manage every crisis everywhere. This question becomes even more important when considering the economic reality. Military power depends on economic power. Advanced weapon systems, global deployments, and long-term operations require enormous financial resources. The United States has maintained a level of global military involvement unmatched in modern history. But that system is becoming increasingly expensive. Debt, domestic priorities, infrastructure needs, and economic competition all place limits on how much can be spent indefinitely. The question is not whether America can afford power. The question is whether it can afford unlimited commitments. History shows that major powers often face a similar problem when their responsibilities grow faster than their resources. They become involved in more regions than they can effectively manage. They spend more maintaining influence than they gain from it, and eventually they must rethink their strategy. This does not happen overnight. It happens slowly through a series of decisions, each one appearing reasonable at the time. A new deployment, a new security promise, a new military operation, a new crisis, until eventually the larger pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Persian Gulf confrontation may represent one of those moments where the pattern becomes visible. It shows the limits of military dominance. It shows the rise of regional powers. It shows the difficulty of forcing political outcomes through pressure alone. And perhaps most importantly, it shows that the international system is moving away from the era where one country could easily shape global events according to its own preferences. The future will likely be more complicated, more competitive, more uncertain. And in that world, the most successful countries may not be the ones that use force the most often. They may be the ones that understand when force cannot solve the problem.